We're backing people, rebels. You know, they call them the rebels, the freedom rebels, they have all these glamorous names, right? We have been in there for 15 years, and we are far worse off now than we were 15 years ago. 15 years ago, we didn't have people coming around. I mean, the whole thing. And in all fairness, we went after Iraq. They did not knock down the World Trade Center, okay? It wasn't the Iraqis that knocked down the World Trade Center. You will find out who really knocked down the World Trade Center because they have papers in there that are very secret. You may find it's the Saudis, okay? But you will find out. But it wasn't Iraq.
Israel's former Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, would boldly state that we are benefiting from one thing, and that is the attack on the Twin Towers and Pentagon.
The United States has wholeheartedly supported essentially state-sponsored terrorism, both domestically in Israel and as part of Israel's foreign policy. The American relationship with Israel is the root cause of most of the problems the United States is facing around the world today.
Well, I would say this, that there's one big elephant in the living room. It's never asked about. People don't like to put it on any video or anything like that. But it is the relationship between the United States of America and the State of Israel. It's the fly in the ointment. It's gotten us into a peck of trouble in the Middle East.
It is my honor to introduce the front runner for the Republican presidential nomination, a captain of industry, investor, author, public personality, a mensch with a lot of chutzpah, ladies and gentlemen, Donald Trump.
I grew up in Brooklyn, Queens, and Israel was always very paramount in our mind. It's an honor to be with you, and I've devoted so much time over my life to Israel. And the other politicians, they can talk, but believe me, they haven't done what I've done. I've received many, many awards. I was the Grand Marshal of the Israeli Day Parade at a very dangerous time when people said, don't do it, don't do it.
Hillary Clinton, is she a friend of Israel?
Whether she is or not, she doesn't have the strength or the energy to help Israel. I'm telling you, she doesn't. Israel needs more than just our support. They need strength. They need real power behind that.
I know Bibi very well. In fact, he asked me if I do a commercial for him. I think I'm the only so-called celebrity that did a commercial for him. And, and it was a nice commercial and everything else, and I hope he's going to do great, and I think he's going to do great.
My name is Donald Trump, and I'm a big fan of Israel. And frankly, a strong prime minister is a strong Israel. And you truly have a great prime minister. In Benjamin Netanyahu, there's nobody like him.
Israel's former Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, would boldly state that we are benefiting from one thing, and that is the attack on the Twin Towers and Pentagon.
The United States has wholeheartedly supported essentially state-sponsored terrorism, both domestically in Israel and as part of Israel's foreign policy. The American relationship with Israel is the root cause of most of the problems the United States is facing around the world today.
We have been in there for 15 years, and we are far worse off now than we were 15 years ago. 15 years ago, we didn't have people coming around. I mean, the whole thing. And in all fairness, we went after Iraq. They did not knock down the World Trade Center, okay? It wasn't the Iraqis that knocked down the World Trade Center. You will find out who really knocked down the World Trade Center because they have papers in there that are very secret. You may find it's the Saudis, okay? But you will find out. But it wasn't Iraq.
Israel's former Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, would boldly state that we are benefiting from one thing, and that is the attack on the Twin Towers and Pentagon.
My name is Donald Trump, and I'm a big fan of Israel. And frankly, a strong prime minister is a strong Israel. And you truly have a great prime minister.
The head of the Port Authority was Louis Eisenberg, and he personally oversaw the privatization that led to Larry Silverstein and Frank Lowy obtaining the 99-year lease for the towers on July 24th, 2001, just 6 weeks before 9/11. But Silverstein demanded and got $3.5 billion worth of insurance payable in cash if the towers were destroyed. Now, the fact that Silverstein was close friends with Benjamin Netanyahu, or that he skipped his daily breakfast at the Windows on the World restaurant located on the 107th floor of the North Tower on 9/11, or that his son and daughter also happened to be unexpectedly absent on 9/11, is all just amazing good fortune, we are told.
In the days before, I think, the World Trade Center, or the Twin Towers, fell, I understand you had daily breakfast meetings with people, I think, in the Windows of the World, the famous restaurant, the World Trade Center.
That's correct.
But you weren't there for breakfast on the day of September 11th. Why was that?
That morning, my wife had made an appointment for me at the dermatologist, who I have to visit with regularity, right? And as I'm dressing to go to the dermatologist that morning, I looked at my wife and said, you know, I've got so much to do downtown. Cancel the dermatologist. I've got to go downtown. She got upset. She said, you can't cancel. You've got to go.
Was that Larry Silverstein's luck?
It was clearly my luck. It was clearly my luck.
Now, the fact that Silverstein was close friends with Benjamin Netanyahu.
In Benjamin Netanyahu, there's nobody like him.
It was widely reported that men had been celebrating the attack after recording the first plane strike. They were not Al-Qaeda, but they were detained.
I grabbed my binoculars and I could see the towers from my window. And this is where I'm looking. And all of a sudden, down there, I see this van parked. And I see 3 guys on top of the van. And I could see that they were like happy. You know, they didn't look shocked to me. You know, they didn't look shocked.
There was a group of Israelis, some of whom later were revealed as Mossad assets, who were arrested after cheering and high-fiving and videotaping the crash of the airplanes into the World Trade Towers.
Several other men were detained after a van full of explosives was stopped outside of Manhattan.
Earlier, we had heard that an FBI spokesperson said that there was a report on the George Washington Bridge, which is another facility which you folks are responsible for policing, a report that there had been a van stopped there that had explosives.
Asked this week about another sprawling investigation and the detention of 60 Israelis since September 11th, the Bush administration treated the questions like hot potatoes.
I would just refer you to the Department of Justice with it. I'm not familiar with the report.
I'm aware that some Israeli citizens have been detained. With respect to why they are being detained and the other aspects of your question, whether it's because they are in intelligence services or what they were doing, I will defer to the Department of Justice and the FBI to answer that.
On March 6, 2002, a draft report from the DEA said it may well be an organized intelligence gathering activity. Despite all of this, all the Israelis were let go without any espionage charges being filed. Fox News anchors Brit Hume and Carl Cameron would do a 4-part investigation into these allegations in December of 2001 and yield stunning results.
It has been more than 16 years since a civilian working for the Navy was charged with passing secrets to Israel. Jonathan Pollard pled guilty to conspiracy to commit espionage and is serving a life sentence. At first, Israeli leaders claimed Pollard was part of a rogue operation, but later took responsibility for his work. Now, Fox News has learned some U.S. investigators believe that there are Israelis again very much engaged in spying in and on the U.S.
Since September 11th, more than 60 Israelis have been arrested or detained, either under the new Patriot anti-terrorism law or for immigration violations. A handful of active Israeli military were among those detained, according to investigators, who say some of the detainees also failed polygraph questions when asked about alleged surveillance activities against and in the United States. Investigators suspect that the Israelis may have gathered intelligence about the attacks in advance and not shared it. A highly placed investigator said there are, quote, tie-ins, but when asked for details, he flatly refused to describe them, saying, quote, evidence linking these Israelis to 911 is classified. I cannot tell you about evidence that has been gathered. It's classified information.
Now, when the FBI investigated, it quickly unraveled to be the largest foreign spy ring ever uncovered inside the United States, the largest. Even the Soviet Union had not been spying on the United States as much as Israel has been doing. So the FBI started to round up these spies. They started to arrest them very quietly, and they were about halfway through this process of rounding up this spy ring when 9/11 happened.
Numerous classified documents obtained by Fox News indicate that even prior to September 11th, as many as 140 other Israelis had been detained or arrested in a secretive and sprawling investigation into suspected espionage by Israelis in the United States. Investigators from numerous government agencies are part of a working group that's been compiling evidence since the mid-90s. These documents detail hundreds of incidents in cities and towns across the country that investigators say, quote, may well be an organized intelligence gathering activity. The first part of the investigation focuses on Israelis who say they are art students from the University of Jerusalem and Bezalel Academy. Documents say they, quote, targeted and penetrated military bases, the DEA, FBI, and dozens of other government facilities, and even secret offices and unlisted private homes of law enforcement and intelligence personnel. The majority of those questioned, quote, stated they served in military intelligence, electronic surveillance intercept, and/or explosive ordnance units. Why would Israelis spy in and on the U.S.? A General Accounting Office investigation referred to Israel as Country A and said, quote, according to a U.S. intelligence agency, the government of Country A conducts the most aggressive espionage operation against the U.S. of any U.S. ally. The document concludes, quote, Israel possesses the resources and technical capability to achieve its collection objectives.
What about this question of advanced knowledge of what was going to happen on 9/11? How clear are investigators that some Israeli agents may have known something?
Well, it's very explosive information, obviously, and there's a great deal of evidence that they say they have collected, none of it necessarily conclusive. It's more when they put it all together. A bigger question, they say, is how could they not have known? Almost a direct quote, Britt.
It is now apparent that this intelligence ring was inside the U.S., had prior knowledge of 9/11, and had a classified role in 9/11, which officials refused to discuss. It was also able to penetrate U.S. intelligence agencies and secret offices, yet all were released. The men who were detained due to the report they were taping the first plane crash and then celebrating and joking about it actually went on television and admitted it was their job to record the attack.
And at that point, we were taken for another round of questioning, this time related to our allegedly being members of Mossad. The fact of the matter is, we are coming from a country that experiences terror daily. Our purpose was to document the event.
How could they have known about the attack? And who sent them to document it? The evidence points to a large intelligence network inside the United States that had teams on the ground, such as the ones recording the attack, and electronic surveillance teams gathering information. Another team who was involved that day detonated explosives on the ground.
We have both suspects under K. We have the suspect who drove in the van exploded.
Yeah, I just want to make sure you and your guys are all right over there, K, that's all.
You know, we have both Trans driven that exploded.
What location?
King Street between 6 and 7.
Shooting is on the scene on King 6 or 7. Which unit are you?
How would these teams obtain their information?
The investigation on our side basically tracked back to two companies. The first one was called Amdocs. This is an Israeli-owned company which does the billing for 90% of the telephone companies inside the United States.
Fox News has learned that some American terrorism investigators fear certain suspects in the September 11th attacks may have managed to stay ahead of them by knowing who and when investigators are calling on the telephone. How? By obtaining and analyzing data that's generated every time someone in the U.S. makes a phone call.
What city and state, please?
Here's how the system works. Most directory assistance calls and virtually all call records and billing in the U.S. are done for the phone companies by Amdocs Limited, an Israeli-based private telecommunications company. Amdocs has contracts with the 25 biggest phone companies in America and more worldwide. It is virtually impossible to make a call on normal phones without generating an Amdocs record of it. In recent years, the FBI and other government agencies have investigated Amdocs more than once. Sources tell Fox News that in 1999, the super-secret National Security Agency, headquartered in northern Maryland, issued what's called a top-secret, sensitive, compartmentalized information report, TSSCI, warning that records of calls in the United States were getting into foreign hands, in Israel in particular. Fox News has learned that the NSA has held numerous classified conferences to warn the FBI and CIA how Amdoc's records could be used.
So if you know the name of a police officer, or even if you know the name just of an informant, you can follow that network of who is talking to who and basically determine that whole association of names and contacts that represent that unit of operation.
Fox News has documents of a 1997 drug trafficking case in Los Angeles in which telephone information, the types that Amdocs collects, was used to, quote, completely compromise the communications of the FBI, the Secret Service, the DEA, and the LAPD.
Amdocs would not be the only company with ties to the Israeli government. Israel was also gathering information from a separate business, Converse Infosys, who was also listening in.
This company, inside the United States, installs and maintains the phone tapping equipment that law enforcement and the government use to eavesdrop on your phone calls.
The company is Converse Infosys, a subsidiary of an Israeli-run private telecommunications firm with offices throughout the U.S. It provides wiretapping equipment for law enforcement. Here's how wiretapping works in the U.S. Every time you make a call, it passes through the nation's elaborate network of switchers and routers run by the phone companies. Custom computers and software made by companies like Converse are tied into that network to intercept, record, and store the wiretapped calls, and at the same time transmit them to investigators.
We know we just had this FISA bill go through that granted immunity to the telecom companies. It was Converse Infosystem that was setting up all these special rooms and all the switching centers where the law enforcement or the government or whoever could simply push a button and listen to your phone call. Gone are the days of the little alligator clips and wires needed to eavesdrop on a phone call. They can sit in a room anywhere in America, touch a few buttons, and listen to your phone call.
But the complaint about this system is that the wiretap computer programs made by Converse have in effect a back door through which wiretaps themselves can be intercepted by unauthorized parties. Adding to the suspicions is the fact that in Israel, Converse works closely with the Israeli government and under special programs gets reimbursed for up to 50% of its research and development costs by the Israeli Ministry of Industry and Trade. But investigators within the DEA, INS, and FBI have all told Fox News that to pursue or even suggest Israeli spying through Converse is considered career suicide. And sources say that while various FBI inquiries into Converse have been conducted over the years, they've been halted before the actual equipment has ever been thoroughly tested for leaks.
More to the point, agents within the U.S. government have been told point blank that to even suggest Israeli spying or an Israel link to 9/11 is career suicide. It's been described as the third rail of American politics. If you touch it, you die. You never get to come back again. It's all over. It's the black pit where you can never go.
But there is a bitter turf war internally at FBI. It is the FBI's office in Quantico, Virginia that has jurisdiction over awarding contracts and buying intercept equipment. And for years, they've thrown much of the business to Converse. A handful of former U.S. law enforcement officials involved in awarding Converse government contracts over the years now work for the company. Numerous sources say some of those individuals were asked to leave government service under what knowledgeable sources call troublesome circumstances that remain under administrative review within the Justice Department. And what troubles investigators most, particularly in New York in the counterterrorism investigation of the World Trade Center attack, is that on a number of cases, suspects that they had sought to wiretap and surveil immediately changed their telecommunications processes. They started acting much differently as soon as those supposedly secret wiretaps went into place.
Somehow, suspected terrorists who were being surveilled by these very Israelis were able to change their behavior to elude the FBI. Israel's former Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, would boldly state that, "We are benefiting from one thing, and that is the attack on the Twin Towers and Pentagon."
The United States has wholeheartedly supported essentially state-sponsored terrorism, both domestically in Israel and as part of Israel's foreign policy. The American relationship with Israel is the root cause of most of the problems the United States is facing around the world today.
Well, I would say this, that there's one big elephant in the living room. It's never asked about. People don't like to put it on any video or anything like that. But it is the relationship between the United States of America and the State of Israel. It's the fly in the ointment. It's gotten us into a peck of trouble in the Middle East.
Hello and welcome to The Autograph with me, Susan Madaris. We are coming to you from New York City, and my guest this week is Dr. Alan Sabrosky. He's joining me via satellite from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Join us. Alan Sabrosky is a writer and consultant specializing in national and international security affairs. In December 1988, he received the Superior Civilian Service Award after more than 5 years of service at the U.S. Army War College as Director of Studies, Strategic Studies Institute, and holder of the General of the Army Douglas MacArthur Chair of Research. A Marine Corps Vietnam veteran and a 1986 graduate of the U.S. Army War College, Dr. Sabrosky's teaching and research appointments have included the U.S. Military Academy and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. While in government service, he held concurrent adjunct professorships at Georgetown University and the Johns Hopkins University of Advanced International Studies. His published work includes 13 books or monographs and over 160 articles, chapters, and book reviews. He is currently completing a book-length study on the U.S. use of military force as an instrument of foreign policy titled Presidential War: The Politics of Military Intervention. Dr. Sabrosky is also an editor at Veterans Today, where his latest series of articles regarding Israeli involvement in the 9/11 attacks against the United States is a shocking expose of how the Israeli Mossad planned the attacks and how the U.S. military had prior knowledge. An argument often not discussed, especially by someone like Alan Sabrosky, who is an American of Jewish ancestry. However, Sabrosky bravely addresses this sensitive and controversial topic as someone devoted to the security of the United States at any cost. So what happens when a military insider puts the devastating terror attacks of 9/11 directly at Israel's doorstep? Dr. Alan Sabrosky, thank you so much for joining us on The Autograph.
My pleasure, Susan.
Tell us how you make the case for Israel's involvement in the tragic 9/11 attacks.
There were several different ways of doing it, Susan, and this may be a little bit more background than some of your people need, but I began to have suspicions about what had happened on 9/11 about 2 weeks after the attacks. There were several discontinuities that made no sense to me whatsoever. The behavior on the part of some of the named terrorists, these 19 Arabs on 4 planes, running around flying schools like loose cannon, not having the pilot skills to fly the aircraft, no recognition for what they had done afterwards in their own area, their own community. And it struck me that for many reasons, none of the arguments that were being given for what they did made any sense. But I then immediately forgot about it until about 2 years ago. And then I came across a video which I found to be extremely disturbing. That video was an interview with a Dutch demolitions expert named Danny Jowenko. And it concerned the collapse of the 3rd World Trade Center tower to go down on September 11th. This was the 47-story World Trade Center 7, the 3rd tallest building at the World Trade Center. Jowenko had never heard of it. Neither had I. And when you looked at the building, you saw that there was effectively no damage to any face of the building. It had not been hit by a plane. It had not been taken major trauma from debris, and it went straight down into its own footprint in about 7 seconds in what was visibly a controlled demolition. You know, and it was pretty clear that whatever those 19 named Arabs on 4 planes, 2 of them at the World Trade Center, had or had not done, they could not have had any possible effect on that 3rd building going down. Shortly after that, I came across, partly out of my own curiosity, which this definitely aroused, and a very extensive video, both of which I've cited, by the way, in some of my recent articles, which were taken on 9/11 itself from what became Ground Zero, the base of World Trade Center 1 and 2, the Twin Towers, involving police, emergency services personnel, newspaper and television correspondents, and you can see and hear secondary explosions at the base of the World Trade Center buildings. Now, planes impacting at 800 to 1,000 feet above the ground are not going to cause secondary explosions at the ground floor. And this followed over into other reports, also there on September 11th, about vans in the area, white vans. In one case, a van was picked up by police and people arrested at the access to a major bridge. The van was filled with explosives, and the two people in it were Israelis. In Bergen, New Jersey, same day, a van with several people in it had set up cameras. Before the first plane hit, they were filming the Twin Towers, and they were celebrating. High fives. It was a good thing for them. Residents called police. Police arrested them. All 5 were Israelis. What intrigued me, in addition to angering me, was that within days, all of these reports disappeared from the media. Most Americans don't know that a third building went down at the World Trade Center. Most have never heard about the secondary explosions reported by CNN, ABC, Fox, and others at the foundation of World Trade Center 1 and 2. None have ever heard about the vans. So I began looking at this very carefully, and one of the things that I began looking at was just what would it have taken for a special operations group of any particular nationality to have done 9/11, either by having taken control of the operation we have been told about, of the 19 named Arabs on 4 planes, or having run a parallel operation where you have 4 planes being hijacked, but there is another operation being done with those in concert. And I picked up 3 particular factors that would need to be taken into account. One was motivation, a second was expertise, and the third, the critical one, was access. Now, when it came to motivation, it's probably a very sad commentary on where we are in the world today, that there are an awful lot of countries and groups out there in the world that have either real or contrived reasons to hate America. It wasn't that way when I was a young man, but then many things weren't the same way now as they were when I was a young man. But almost all of the groups and countries that might want to do this only had a negative reason for doing it. They wanted to hurt us. The Israelis had a positive reason, and it's one that a number of their supporters had talked about from the 1990s on up, and what was called the Project for a New American Century, whose members included, by the way, later Vice President Richard Cheney, later Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, and many of the so-called neoconservatives, most of them Jewish but not all, who came into the first Bush administration. Israel had a positive reason, and it was get the United States involved in a war in the Middle East with a powerful, enraged, anti-Islamic strain within the American public, that they needed a catalytic event to produce this. They even talked about it in terms of another Pearl Harbor is needed to bring the American people into this fight. The second was expertise. Lots of expertise out there. Bringing buildings down and controlled demolitions is something that almost any intelligence agency of any country in the world can do or can contract. There are many private agencies that do this. But one thing is absolutely clear. Neither those 19 named Arabs on the plane nor Al-Qaeda as an organization had the expertise, the technical expertise to do that. And there is one very clear proof of that. If Al-Qaeda and its affiliates had had the ability to wire even one building for a controlled demolition at the World Trade Center, much less all three of them, the so-called green zone in the heart of Baghdad would have been a pile of rubble. And it wasn't. But the last is access. The World Trade Center security was an Israeli-owned company. Security at all three of the airports from which the 4 aircraft on 9/11 departed, ICTS, was an Israeli security company. That security company, by the way, also had security at the airports in Paris and Amsterdam later, from which the so-called shoe and underwear bombers departed. The security company at the World Trade Center had 24/7 state-of-the-art electronic surveillance and foot patrols. Wiring a building for a controlled demolition, and I must confess here, this is not my specialty. I have heard what people who do this for a living have said about it, but it is not my specialty. But the description of it in the video of Danny Jawenko that I mentioned to you is a very good one on this. And he described it in which if you needed to do it in a few hours, you would need 30 to 40 people, fewer if you had more time, cutting open the walls, literally cutting open the walls, all the way around the building, implanting the explosives, running detonator cord and cable, wires to put them to a control system, coordinating all of this activity. This is not something that involves the casual bringing in of a briefcase and leaving it at the foot of a building's elevator and going out again. This is extensive work, and it would require the type of extensive sustained access that could not go unremarked by the security forces in place on this. They also needed the ability to evade an apprehension and to have their escape concealed. And they had that done. All of the Israelis who were apprehended in those vans were later released in about 2 months at the direction of Michael Chertoff, then the second director of Homeland Security, a dual U.S.-Israeli national. There is no mention of them in the mainstream media, which is largely Zionist-owned. All of the major networks, all of the major national newspapers, all 3 of the weekly news magazines, all of the major political journals, most of the major publishing houses. It simply didn't happen. The only thing that happened on 9/11 that was discussed in the media, that have been accepted by the government, that was described in the 9/11 Commission, are 19 named Arabs on 4 planes bringing down 2 buildings. And the rest of it, in Orwellian terms, has become a non-event and a non-story.
And you know, since you just pointed to the 9/11 Commission report, there is an understanding that the primary motivation for 9/11 was U.S. support for Israel's brutal oppression of the Palestinians, also conveyed in the 9/11 Commission report. I guess my question is, how are these 2 incidents or theories, so to say, related? And, you know, there are those that will brush off your argument as a conspiracy theory. Are you concerned?
I don't think that's so much of a conspiracy theory. I was smiling when you said that because to tell a bit of a story on this. Back in the early 80s, when I was in Washington at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, one of our visitors for a luncheon talk was a young gentleman then named Francois Heisbourg. Heisbourg was the special assistant to French President Francois Mitterrand. And I don't know how the subject came up, but he said, you know, Americans never see conspiracies anywhere. We French, he said, we see conspiracies everywhere. And both of us are wrong. This is not a conspiracy in the sense that it is usually used, the word is usually used, which is to denigrate an opposing argument. When someone in the United States says that that's a conspiracy or that's a conspiracy theory, by definition they mean it is irrational, illegitimate, and without proof. All I would suggest to people is that you look at the films of WTC-7, that third tower going down on September 11th. You look and listen to the reports on September 11th with the secondary explosions. These are not fantasies. They happened. You look at the reports on September 12th of the apprehension of Israelis with vans of explosives and cameras filming the events on September 11. These are not fantasies. And you look at the people riddling the American government, all of the Middle East people in State Defense and the National Security Council, Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Douglas Feith, who used to be a friend of mine, by the way, from Philadelphia. These people were all part of the neoconservative movement. Many of these people are dual U.S.-Israeli nationals. All of their primary allegiance is to Israel.
In a recent article, Stubrowski explains why he is anti-Israeli. He notes, because of what it has done to the U.S. in the furtherance of its own goals. The USS Liberty incident and 9/11 obviously stand out. And because of the leverage it has acquired over the U.S. government and its policies through the machinations of the domestic Jewish community here.
My concern is that I don't much care about other people or other countries. I don't hate anyone in particular. I don't like anyone in particular. I'm an American. My loyalty is strictly to the United States. And I don't care what my ethnicity is or what my ancestry is. My allegiance is that. And my concern is only whether something helps or hurts the United States. And I think anyone who's a citizen of any country can very properly have similar feelings toward their country. What I'm concerned about is what is done to hurt America. And it is very clear that over a period of the last 40-odd years, that the penetration of the American political process, the effective subordination of the Congress in particular to Israel, when an Israeli prime minister can get 29 standing ovations from a Congress that can't give that much support to one of their own presidents, no matter how outlandish the statements, you have something as close to a puppet agency as you're going to find. Our policy in the Middle East has for decades been manipulated increasingly in terms of what benefits Israel and not what benefits the United States, even when that policy is articulated and supported by individuals who are sworn officials of the United States government. And to me, when a sworn official of the United States government, whether or not that person has dual Israeli citizenship, manipulates American policy, contrives crises and tragedies like 9/11, contrives wars like Afghanistan and Iraq, and now tries to get us into a war with Iran, all in the service of Israel, spending American lives in that process, they commit high treason. And they need to be treated in that manner.
In his article, Zionism Unmasked, the Dark Face of Jewish Nationalism, Stubrowski looks at the differences between Jewish nationalism, or Zionism, and that of other countries and cultures. He argues that, first of all, Zionism is a real witch's brew of xenophobia, racism, ultranationalism, and militarism that places it way outside of a mere nationalist context. Secondly, Zionism undermines civic loyalty. Thirdly, the enemy of normal nationalist movement is the occupying power, and perhaps its allies. And once independence is achieved, normal relations with the occupying power are truly the norm. But for Zionism, almost everyone out there is an actual or potential enemy. I continue our interview by asking him about his theory.
Well, I think the first thing to note, and I want to be sure that this is emphasized, is that Jewish nationalism or Zionism is not Judaism. It has nothing to do with Judaism. Many of the Zionists are very secular Jews. They are not practicing Jews in a religious sense. The thing that's intriguing about Zionism, and I think I use the phrase that it's a real witch's brew of xenophobia, ultranationalism, and militarism, with a nice scrap of regional imperialism built into it. Most nationalism is not like that. Most nationalism is intended to be a unifying force, but it doesn't go to such an extreme level. A second element of it is that when you have competing nationalisms, it's very, very rare to find anything that involves the level of antipathy and hatred to the other side.
Sobrowski believes that Americans should see where they stand now, what should be done, and where America must stand if it wishes to alter the world Zionism has contrived. While he paints a realistic picture of what the current situation is, he addresses why so many attempts to contain Zionism in the U.S. have failed throughout the years. You know, a good friend of the show, James Morris, who has contributed greatly not only to this show, The Autograph, but also in raising public awareness, notably on his website, AmericaHijacked.com. I remember him saying that he was a registered Republican for many years, but ultimately found it very hard as an American to relate to that party, or the Democratic Party for that matter, and became extremely frustrated, notably because of the government's support for AIPAC and similar organizations, and the United States support for Israel in general. Just recently, he was quoted as saying that he has become an independent. But I guess my question is, and my point is, that are we seeing more public awareness, more frustration inside the United States among Americans, because the ones that I talk to seem to be very, very upset, to say the least, and they seem to feel very strongly about this issue.
I think many Americans are finding it difficult to relate to their government, but the idea that there's any kind of a mass movement there because of the relationship to Israel is simply not the case. There is no vehicle for that type of opposition to have been created. There is not even an awareness on the part of most of the American people about the details of 9/11 that I mentioned to you. One of my last article was much more of a practical, how do we get the word out? And I think that if people did understand what had really happened at 9/11, you could very rapidly see a very substantial reorientation of public opinion.
Dr. Alan Sobrowski, thank you so much for those comments. So much more to talk about. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Hopefully, we will see you back on The Autograph next time here in New York City.
Susan, thank you very much. I sincerely hope I too can meet you there, and I'm only sorry that the missed plane connections didn't make it possible last night.
No worries. It was a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you, Susan. You take care. All the best wishes to you.
That's all the time we have for this edition of The Autograph here on Press TV. Thank you for staying with us and watching. Remember, you can always send us your emails to The Autograph at SusanMadaris.com. We are always looking forward to them. Until next week in another show from all of us here in New York City. Goodbye.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition.
Zeker weten.
Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the document from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved in melting those steel beams.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.